What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? What would you dare to try if you knew that you couldn't fail? I really like this question because it stimulates my imagination, my thinking. It stretches the way I see things. But after reading the gospel lesson for this week and thinking about it, I'm thinking that it's the wrong question to ask. Because there's going to be failure. There just will be. Failure is a part of life. And so, maybe all this time when I've been asking myself that question, thinking about things that I would do only if I knew I wasn't going to fail, I've set myself up either to be sorely disappointed because failure is really part of what we do, or maybe just scared myself out of doing some things that I would have liked to have done. So in light of today's question, in light of this story of blind Bartimaeus, let me ask a better question. What would you do if you knew that it just might fail and that it just didn't matter? And by didn't matter, I mean it in the sense that not that it wouldn't have any cost or not that it wouldn't be difficult or disappointing. What I mean is, what would you try if the attempt itself was worth it, whether or not it succeeds? Or maybe in other words, what would you risk if the ultimate outcome was guaranteed, even if your immediate venture failed? What would you do, in other words, if failure didn't matter? What mission would you undertake? What would you risk? What great deed would you try? Would you be like blind Bartimaeus in today's gospel reading, shouting out for healing even though the people around you keep trying to shush you? I wonder if Bartimaeus was just so used to failure that he really didn't care anymore and didn't see any reason not to try one more time. Or perhaps it was faithfulness itself, defined by trusting God enough to dare impossible deeds. Whatever the case was with Bartimaeus, would that be your cry? Would you cry out for healing? Or maybe you would cry out for justice or peace or equality, any of the other handful of things that the world calls idealistic. Or maybe you would volunteer at a food pantry or to tutor a child who needs help at school. Maybe you would care for somebody who's severely disabled. Kids, maybe you would befriend another kid at school that nobody else seems to like. Maybe you'd visit a shut-in that everyone else seems to have forgotten about. Maybe you would have the courage to reach out to somebody that you know that is overwhelmed with grief, so overwhelmed that you just really don't know what it is that you would say to them. What would you do if failure didn't matter? So often these things that we would do whether they're big things or small things, either seem ridiculously insignificant or hopelessly impossible, so we just don't try. Either it's not going to happen anyhow, or it wouldn't make a difference. Yet the promise of the gospel is that we are free. Do we use the freedom that we're given in Jesus Christ? Do we really care about it? Do we do anything with it? Do our actions show that we know that we're free? I can promise you all too often mine don't. We're free. We're free to risk. We're free to dare. We're free to try. We're free to love and to live and to work and to dream and to struggle. And whether the thing that we want to attempt seems great or small, likely or nearly impossible, we're free to do it. Because we have God's promise that there is no small gesture and no impossible deed. And for this reason, we're free. Even free to fail, trusting that the God who raised Jesus from the dead will bring all things, everything, even our failed efforts, to a good end. I like movies, and every once in a while in a movie there's just a line that you really love, and sometimes I don't really remember too much about the movies, but I remember those lines. And there's a line, it comes from Apollo 13. And it's the flight director at NASA. He's played by Ed Harris. And he says boldly, "Failure is not an option." It was just kind of a big dramatic part in that movie. And I find that line so inspiring. Failure is not an option. Except for the fact that the opposite is true. Failure is most definitely an option. Failure is regularly the option. Because risk entails failure. For us to actually live out the freedom that we have in the gospel, the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ, that entails risk, and risk entails failure. Change entails failure. Creativity and innovation and experimentation entails failure. And if we forget that, then we'll either never try anything that matters or end up sorely disappointed when we do. You know, this Sunday, tomorrow, is Reformation Sunday in the church. This is Reformation Week. And I read a story about Martin Luther that I hadn't heard before, and I thought it seemed appropriate in this time of the church year and with the lesson this week. I knew that Luther had died in Eisleben, the place of his birth, and that brought his work and his life, in a sense, full circle. And I had read that he preached his last sermon there in Eisleben after successfully negotiating some disputes between local magistrates. This is the part I hadn't heard before. 5 people showed up to hear that last sermon of Luther's life. And he was ticked, disappointed. I don't know, maybe ticked isn't the right word. He was crushed. Everything that he had put his life into, and 5 people showed up to hear that last sermon. And he wrote to a friend about the event, despairing over what he feared was a failed Reformation. The great reformer, Martin Luther, who was bold, who tried something, who taught us a great deal about what we know about our freedom in the gospel, likely died thinking that his big endeavor in life, the one big risk that he took, the Great Reformation, was a failure. And while I think I can understand his disappointment, I think that at that moment Luther forgot that much of our effort and our energy is going to be given over to failed endeavors. He'd forgotten Paul's reminder that we have all sinned and fallen short, and that we continue to sin and fall short. Most importantly, I think he'd forgotten that our ultimate hope rests not on our own successes, but in God's great failure on the cross. The failure that redeems all failures and successes and binds them together in the promise of resurrection. He'd forgotten that in his own words, at the close of the hymn that will be sung in many churches across the land tomorrow, were they to take our house, goods, child, honor, or spouse, though life be wrenched away, they cannot win the day. God's kingdom's ours forever. This is God's doing. So we're free. We're free to risk. We're free to dare. We're free to love, to live, to work, to dream, to struggle. Even, and perhaps most importantly, we're free to fail. All of those things in hope. So we cannot fear, and we cannot give up. We have to keep the faith. We have to keep on trying and failing. And we have to remember that God promised to keep hold of us and to use us and to use this church in ways that we cannot even begin to imagine. So let's go out from this place, starting right now, starting this evening, as we leave from this place, let's go out and mess some stuff up. Let's fail. Let's go out and fail together and fail boldly and grandly. Because if we fail at enough things, we're going to succeed at some really big things and some really important things. And whether we fail or succeed, Christ has us. He has us in his hand. And he's going to take care of us no matter what happens with those failures or successes. Amen.